Okay, so perhaps we should start. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us for this session on rivalry and development views from Asia. This is a joint session of the American Society of International Law and the Asian Society of International Law. And we do appreciate the efforts of the American Society of International Law to facilitate these types of collaborative projects, which actually provide a whole range of ideas, a whole range of participants that have not always been possible to feature in our programs in the past in the American Society. So the program today is dealing with this huge topic of development. Development, of course, has been a major concern of developing countries, so important, in fact, that they describe themselves as developing countries. It has been a major preoccupation of countries after they achieved their independence in the 1940s, 1950s, and so forth. The right to development is an expression of that concern. It is an initiative of the developing countries. And similarly, of course, Harry Truman famously proclaimed the whole concept of development at his inauguration. So it's been very much a Western project as well. In recent times, I think it is fair to say that although development has been this major concern, much of the attention has focused on Western initiatives of development, of the work of the World Bank, for instance, and of the work of the AID, the various development agencies that are based in the West. So in this panel, we want to take a different approach. We want to have a look at what is happening in terms of development as far as various emerging powers, if we can call them that. In the case of China, you could say China has well and truly emerged. What are their approaches to development? And what can we learn from those particular policies, strategies, and so forth? And development, of course, intersects with pretty much every area we can think of in international law, whether it is the environment, whether it is trade, whether it is human rights. So it is all encompassing and a crucial issue for that reason. In terms of how we shall proceed, each speaker will speak for 10 minutes, and or perhaps a little bit more, but I will inform them when 10 minutes has passed. And then we welcome your questions in the chat, and we hope to leave enough time for a good discussion. This is a 1-hour program, so we'll try to fit that all in. Let me just very briefly introduce speakers, and we thank them all for joining us. So our first speaker will be Aparna Chandra, who is an associate professor of law at the National Law School of India in Bangalore. She teaches and researches on constitutional law, human rights, gender and the law, and empirical legal studies. Our second speaker is Matthew Airy, and I have to particularly thank Matthew for everything he has done to get this program in place. So Matthew is an associate professor and member of the law faculty and associate research fellow of the Center for Social Legal Studies at the University of Oxford. He's trained in both anthropology and law. He is currently the principal investigator of the China Law and Development Project based at the University of Oxford. Our third speaker is Dr. Dilini Pathirana from Sri Lanka. We are particularly pleased that she is joining us because Sri Lanka is going through a somewhat difficult time at the moment. Dr. Pathirana has a Bachelor of Laws and Master of Laws degree from the University of Colombo in Sri Lanka. And she has a PhD from a very well-known institution in China, the China University of Political Science and Law. And she has been on the permanent faculty at the... is anything permanent? I thought this is a Buddhist country. Nothing is permanent. Anyway, she's been a member of the faculty at the University of Colombo since 2009. Our next speaker, and we're very grateful for her joining us. It is quite late in Nagoya, where she is located, is Professor Emi Makino of Nagoya University, who is a graduate of Nagoya University, and she teaches in the School of Graduate of Law and Political Science. We're very pleased to have all these speakers, and we hope we get different dimensions of development emerging from their presentations. So without further ado, let me call on you, Aparna, to please give us your comments. Thanks.
Thank you, Tony. And thank you so much for having me on this panel. The time is short, so and I have much to say, so I'm just going to jump right in. So as Tony mentioned, and as the panel description notes, development and the right to development is a very capacious and a very contested concept. And I'm going to touch on 3 questions that that arise from the contestations around the right to development. One, what does development mean? Two, whose development? And three, who gets to decide what development should entail? So my primary area of work is in Indian constitutional law. And so in thinking through these questions, I will be focusing on how courts in India have engaged with the right to development and with what consequences. And I think this Indian domestic experience will speak to some of the concerns that we are grappling with today. Just as a very brief background, the Indian Supreme Court has, over a range of cases, read in international human rights into the scope of fundamental rights guaranteed under the Constitution, particularly in the right to life that's guaranteed under Article 21 of the Constitution. Now, these international human rights that have been read, it include the right to development, the right to sustainable development, the right to clean and healthy environment, amongst another range of human rights. And the court has understood these rights as imposing positive obligations of action on the state. So this means that a claim of development can be framed as a fundamental right, and it can be seen as a constitutional imperative upon the state. So then the question of what does development mean becomes a very crucial one. Now, the Indian Supreme Court has understood development as primarily linked to economic growth and as linked to linear models of societal progress, almost civilizational progress. So, for example, the court has understood the right to sustainable development as requiring a balance between economic growth on the one hand and environmental protection on the other. But balancing means that the goal of economic growth cannot be set aside environment. Rather, economic growth has to be pursued while mitigating as far as possible the model of development. Economic growth is the primary objective, and rights and environmental concerns operate almost as side constraints that should be accounted for, but they cannot trump the pursuit of case that while economic development should not be allowed to take place at the cost of ecology, the necessity to preserve ecology and the environment should also not hamper economic and other developments. So economic development should take place while taking care to ensure the protection of environment, right? So how does the court do this? How does the court get to this point of equating economic growth with other rights, such as the right to environment or other human rights? The right to development itself is so capacious that it is read as including an abstract set of goals, and all of these goals are then raised to the level of fundamental rights, which can then both be legitimated as justified state goals, and they become equally salient as a competing fundamental right. So, for example, development projects, which may have ecological impacts and may have, say, for example, large-scale displacement, they're all justified as instruments for the state to secure the right to life. And so, therefore, to further fundamental rights rather than to detract from fundamental rights. So, for example, in a case about a large dam that was likely to have a significant environmental impact, and that was going to result in the displacement of a large segment of the local population, which was mostly an indigenous population. The court says that the right to development includes this whole spectrum of human rights and socio-cultural rights, but the construction of a dam or a mega project is itself an attempt to achieve the goal of a wholesome development. So, and I'm quoting, such works could very well be treated as an integral component of development. So now the building of the dam is itself an expression of the state's obligation to secure the right to life. It is of the same normative rights to life, autonomy, dignity, culture, etc., and it's commensurable with those rights. It's fungible. These are all fungible rights. So in these cases, the court's focus is only on mitigating the impact of development, which is itself understood as economic growth. The concept of development, or who gets to decide what development means, these are not questioned. The paradigm of developmental discourse is not questioned. Development is almost a catch-all phrase. When something is framed as a developmental imperative, that is enough to raise the salience of that project to the level of fundamental rights. There's no questioning of the model of development, whose development, at what cost, etc. The only focus is on mitigation of harms. So this commensurability of development as economic growth with other human rights feeds into the second ambiguity that I was talking about in the developmental discourse. That is, who holds the right to development? Is it the individual? Is it a community? Or is it the nation? Now, the court often has this unstated assumption, sometimes it's an explicit assumption, that the right to development is that of the nation as a whole. So if the whole nation has a right to development, which is being realized by a developmental project, then the rights of those who are most directly impacted by this project can be set aside on a consequential balancing of interests. So, for example, in a case where the state was setting up a nuclear power plant and this was being challenged by the local community as violating their right to life, the court says that, yes, we understand that setting up this nuclear power plant might have an impact on the right to life of the local community, but it will also uphold the right to life in a larger sense. What is this larger sense? The right to life in the larger sense is the production of nuclear energy, which is of extreme importance for economic growth of the country, poverty alleviation, generation of employment, so on and so forth. And so the court says we have to take an overall view of the larger public interest rather than just the quote unquote smaller violation of the right to life guaranteed to the local community. So we repeatedly see this logic of the right to development of the larger nation being weighed against the rights asserted by the people who are most directly impacted by the development project to uphold the validity of the development project with some requirement for mitigation. And this links now to the third and the last issue that I wanted to raise, which is who decides what model of development the state should pursue. The right to development in international law assumes that there's going to be some level of participation in understanding development itself, but this participatory element is largely missing from the Indian judicial discourse. The court assumes, for example, that indigenous communities are the passive recipients and beneficiaries of development and not active participants in policy making. The state has the obligation to determine developmental goals and to implement them. To the extent that local communities are impacted, their rights have to be weighed against the larger right to development of the nation. But as frequently, the court says that the persons that are claiming the rights, claiming that their rights are being infringed, are actually the beneficiaries of development, and their rights are being protected, not infringed. Right? This is gaslighting 101. So, for example, when when claims of development-induced displacement are brought before the court, this is often justified on the ground that the displaced people will be better off under whatever rehabilitation scheme that the state is setting up than their life before the displacement. So, for example, again, the court justified a large dam project that displaced indigenous populations by saying that this displacement is not going to result in a violation of their fundamental rights because they're going to be rehabilitated, and the rehabilitation sites will be will have better amenities than those that they enjoyed in their tribal hamlets. And the court says, and I quote, their gradual assimilation in the mainstream of society will lead to betterment and progress. Of course, whose understanding of betterment, what notion of progress, whether the people who are being displaced share these views is not something that the court goes into. So what is happening here is that the state and the court is determining and legitimating particular conceptions of development without engaging with the affected communities on what development means to them. Other scholars have of course, called this development aggression, this top-down imposition of what development means, what it requires, and who sacrifice it claims. So ultimately, the right to development discourse, as is articulated by the Supreme Court, has largely become a fig leaf to legitimate extractive, exploitative, capitalist agendas of the neoliberal state. As Upendra Bakshi has noted, development now appears as a new theology in which democratic articulation emerges as a sin against the people. That means that the state is then justified in repressing, often violently, resistance to development agendas of the state. In fact, the court conceives of its own role as an enabler of the state's vision of development, and it has said that no organ of the state, including the court itself, should become an impediment in the process of development as long as the government is acting in accordance with the law. And of course, just linking it to the larger global processes, these development endeavors of the Indian state are directly linked to global discourses on development, to multinational financial institutions and interstate collaborations that often drive and fund these development projects, and the global financial flows that are seeking new lands for extracting natural resources to feed the global capitalist machinery. So the ambiguities of the right to development allow for co-opting the language of rights to legitimate their coercive agendas. Okay, I think I'm just maybe a minute over time, so I'll stop here and happy to take questions at the end.
Thanks so much, Aparna. In fact, you have 15 seconds left, but thank you so much for packing such a rich account in such a short time. And I'm sure that will generate a lot of discussion. I have lots of questions. We'll leave it for the moment. And now let's shift to Matthew. So, Matthew.
Thank you very much, Professor Angi. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I want to thank Professor Angi for his leadership in organizing this event, and also just for his scholarship, which is wholly inspiring. So thank you, Professor Angi. I'm going to share my screen. So 1 second, please. Hopefully everybody can see that. Okay, terrific. So I'm going to begin with a quote. While China's growth experience cannot be replicated, it provides valuable lessons and learnings for other developing countries, especially during the post-pandemic period, when developing countries need to revisit their macroeconomic, financial, trade, and industrial policies to recover better with equitable and resilient growth. So this quotation does not come from the Chinese government or from the PRC embassy or consulate in a country, say like Tajikistan, but rather it comes from the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, an intergovernmental organization established to promote the interests of developing states in world trade, specifically from a report that was issued just this year on China's structural transformation. What can developing countries learn? So on the one hand, it's clear that in issuing this report and in making this statement, similar statements in the report, that UNCTAD is doing its job. This is very unlike what was reported about 10 years ago when NYU scholar Frank Upham in his 2009 article, From Dem Sets to Dung, Speculations on the Implications of Chinese Growth for Law and Development Theory, noted that international organizations did not take China seriously, in fact, rather discounted China or marginalized China's experience. China's growth models have both tremendous promise, but they also have serious shortcomings, and there's a lot at stake. This is the question that leads the China Law and Development Project, which I'm fortunate to be the principal investigator for, a project that is funded by a grant from the European Research Council in Brussels. It's a 5-year project, an interdisciplinary and international project with over 40 research associates from all over the world, including Brazil, Mongolia, Nigeria, Kyrgyzstan, and elsewhere. One of the tasks that we're trying to do in the project is to really understand the process of how China is transforming international law and potentially the internal legal orders of host states that receive Chinese capital through the perspectives of those based in those host states. So there's really kind of a perspectival or an epistemological kind of vantage that we're assuming in the project through various law and social science methodologies and theories. Delini, who's actually going next, who I'm delighted has recently joined our project, is going to provide, I think, very much that perspective. I'm going to focus on more kind of the supply side in terms of how China is thinking about its own development projects overseas. So to begin with the question, what do we mean by development? Here's two very kind of simplified or stylized timelines. The top is the US, the bottom is China. It's clear that different donor states have different understandings of the concept of development, and also their understandings change over time, right? In terms of how much is economic, material, how much is ideological or political or even potentially spiritual, civilizational. Obviously, there's changes that occur. And looking at the US, it is clear that there was a law and development effort beginning in the 1960s as the US was very focused on exporting its particular approach to using law for economic development purposes, primarily through legal aid, legal education, judicial reforms in Latin America, Asia, and elsewhere. At the same time, the US was promoting infrastructure projects in many of these recipient states. Interestingly enough, that ended in 1973, the infrastructure side of things, when Congress decided that infrastructure as aid was no longer beneficial, and also coincided with the Overseas Private Investment Corporation term being ended through the Foreign Assistance Act of 1964. However, the focus on rule of law aid continued, particularly in 1990s, with the so-called rule of law revival, and this was infused by ideologies of neoliberalism, including in particular privatization of property rights, and obviously the international financial institutions, World Bank, IMF, et cetera, were very much on board with this new kind of vision. However, 2008 financial crisis, 2017 Trump administration, and most recently the US pullout of Afghanistan signal a potential crisis in this particular mode of engagement in aid overseas. However, we can see in the US experience, there's a very tight link between law and development. US developmental aid was intended for both hard infrastructure, but primarily for soft infrastructure. Again, law-related programming that focused on US interests and values, democracy promotion, rule of law, building environments for transactional security for US multinationals operating in potentially high-risk environments overseas. Now shifting to China, we see beginning with the timeline that China was still mired in the Cultural Revolution when the US was starting its early efforts. However, even when the Cultural Revolution was not yet over, in 1975, China completed the Tazara Railway in East Africa, so a pretty extraordinary accomplishment. This investment that China had in Africa was would only deepen through time, particularly in the 1990s. There was a boom in outbound investment from China, where investment projects are very much linked to trade and aid assistance projects as well. 2013, as we know, the Belt and Road Initiative was announced, which inaugurated a new stage in Chinese funded and managed infrastructure and energy projects in low-income and middle-income states around the world. We don't have the aid figures, they're not publicized, but we can see one metric of this investment through the actual overseas investment figures themselves. There was a peak in 2016, a decline at the beginning of the pandemic. But however, even as early as 2020, there was an uptick up to 153.71 billion US dollars in that year, when China became the largest capital exporting country in the world. And 89% of Chinese ODI is going to developing countries as of 2020. In the Chinese developmental approach, you can see a focus on both hard and soft infrastructure, primarily the former. And it's also tied to China's own interests and values. So economic development without political conditionalities, poverty alleviation without liberalization, avoidance of legal reform in host states, amongst many. So here's just kind of a basic scheme to compare law and development as we understand it, primarily through the US experience with China's law and development approach. And just very briefly, we can see the sort of ideological underpinnings of the US approach as opposed to China, which is primarily pragmatic in its approach. We can see in law and development a focus on the host state, oftentimes coupled with interests of the home state, that is the US, whereas in China, oftentimes it's China's own interests, which are pushing a lot of the projects, but in conversation with political elites in the host state. And then some institution building on the Chinese side versus in the US is very much central to what they were doing. And in China, in the Chinese experience, we see an enhanced role of informal dimensions of law and development, and also in networking that's oftentimes transnational in nature. And these represent shifts from the US precedent. So what kind of global development actor is China? Well, I think it's helpful to kind of look at a few of the concepts which have a certain type of currency in the Chinese lexicon. And there are two: the right to development and the people-centered human rights. And I don't have the time to go through the whole kind of history, pedigree of these concepts, but briefly, obviously China has inherited the notion of right to development, as we've discussed. This is not something that's unique to China, but China has its own definition of right to development and something that's become a centerpiece for China's human rights policy since its first white paper was issued on human rights in 1991. And essentially the concept is focused on national conditions as opposed to universal standards or norms, okay? And China has become a champion of socioeconomic rights over civil and political ones, and the strong role of the state or the party, in this case, the Chinese Communist Party, as guarantor of that right to development. This notion has found itself in a number of UN documents and also related concepts of, for example, community of shared future, the Renlei Mingyun Gonggongti, and other concepts that have been disseminated from Beijing outward. Another concept is people-centered human rights, which essentially is a focus on how, again, the state or the party serves as vanguard for the people, not civil society. So the concept here is that states have rights, and it's not that individuals have negative rights vis-a-vis states, right? And this notion also has been incorporated into various international organizations, for example, the Human Rights Committee resolution listed here. Now, what's interesting is that in many cases, the Belt and Road Initiative, even though it's been criticized and has encountered resistance or pushback, it's been remarkably successful. And how do we know that? Well, everybody's copying it. So for example, we have the Build Back Better World led by the G7 and the US, which is designed to provide infrastructure in low-income countries. It's values-driven, it promotes good governance and strong standards through the Blue Dot Network, which is also led by the US and its allies. The EU has its Global Gateway, which lists 300 billion euros from 2021 to 2027 to promote smart, clean, and secure links in digital energy and transport. And not to be outdone, there's the Indian Development Assistance Scheme, or IDEAS, which extends lines of credit to low-income countries in South Asia and Africa. So you can see that in many cases, China is setting the agenda for global development. This is in many ways a good thing because China is meeting a demand. However, there are negative sides of this as well. China is providing certain types of public goods over others. The beneficiaries in many instances are political elites and non-democratic states rather than the population at large. There's a high level of non-transparency or opacity in these projects, and this impacts local governance, environment, labor, and legal and judicial systems. So let me just quickly here, I know my time is almost out, but I think it's important to note that China is moving from a physical to a normative infrastructure. So China is now creating normative infrastructures that undergirds physical and digital infrastructures. And this is through primarily international economic law. This is a conference in Beijing featuring not just Chinese lawyers and stakeholders, but also those from Africa and other Asian states. And then lastly, I just wanted to end on a note here, since Professor Angi is our moderator, a quote from his book: the very mechanisms by which the civilizing mission is furthered prevent its fulfillment, and that further, the process of incorporation that is conventionally understood to be empowering and liberating for the third world is, in significant ways, debilitating and excluding. So the question here is whether or not the Chinese approach is a corrective to past Euro-American approaches, or whether it duplicates and extends some of the pre-existing injustices and iniquities. And that's a debate we can have. I will stop there, and thank you so much for your attention.
Thanks, Matthew. If we can switch from sharing screen and return to the panel. So thanks very much, Matthew. For that overview and for that very illuminating comparison. And it links very nicely with Aparna's presentation as well, in all sorts of ways. And perhaps not very, perhaps not in ways that are entirely to be welcome, but we'll leave that for further discussion. So it's really important to hear from countries which are, you could say, the countries in which these development programs, these Asian development programs, are being furthered and implemented. And I can't think of a better example than Sri Lanka, given that in Sri Lanka we have, you could say, Japanese development programs, Indian development programs, Chinese development programs, US development programs, and yet the country is not in a very happy condition. Matthew mentioned, was kind enough to mention my writing. And I think approach these issues historically, and Sri Lanka seems to be something like in the 18th century when we had the Dutch and the Portuguese and the British, all these major states being involved in Sri Lankan affairs. But will we ever learn? I don't know. We look forward to hearing from you, Dilini, on that topic. Thanks.
Oh, thank you, Professor. And let me share my screen. Yeah, given my background in international investment law and Chinese investment in Sri Lanka, but I thought of, as I mentioned in the title, I would like to add the Sri Lankan perspective to the discussion. In doing so, I argued that the ongoing great power competition in Asia has compelled Sri Lanka to attach greater geopolitical weight when making decisions relating to the country's major development projects, particularly in strategic or critical infrastructure such as ports and energy. Indeed, this results from a complex combination of internal and external factors beyond the scope of this short presentation. However, I would like to support my argument by providing some examples demonstrating how difficult it has become for Sri Lanka to handle its investment or, broadly speaking, development relations with some of the nations involved in this geopolitical competition in the region of Asia. Before turning to these examples, let me provide a brief background to set the context for the subsequent discussion on Sri Lanka's unique experience in this respect. So, as extensively discussed in the literature, the geopolitical and geoeconomic significance of the Indian Ocean region has been increasing, and evident competition has developed among the nations who aspire to have a strategic regional presence for economic and security reasons. Those nations mainly include the USA, India, Japan, as well as Australia. For those countries, Sri Lanka is very crucial due to the country's strategic location in the Indian Ocean. And in this context, increased Chinese development projects in Sri Lanka's critical industries such as ports, transport, energy, and telecommunication have become troublesome in the viewpoint of the nations with sharp interest in Asia, especially in the Indian Ocean region. This is because those development projects in Sri Lanka have been expounded as means which provide China with a strategic grip in the region, which is furthered by similar Chinese-driven infrastructure development projects taking place in other Indian Ocean countries such as Pakistan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, and the Maldives. So, as such, Chinese increased presence in the Sri Lanka has persuaded those concerned or alarming nations to secure similar opportunities in developing Sri Lanka's strategic infrastructure to counterbalance actually China's influence in the country as well as in the region. So in doing so, some countries have employed investment as an influential foreign policy tool that has strengthened its diplomatic ties with Sri Lanka, perhaps with the purpose of turning their economic influence into a political leverage in the future. At the same time, those concerned or alarming nations have come up with several individual as well as joint development programs to prevent China from becoming the single power that dominates the Indian Ocean while checking China's already realized strategic influence in the region. So in this context, it has become difficult for Sri Lanka to make its own decision regarding some of its major development projects. This is my observation because the geopolitical concerns over those projects have drastically shaped the country's approach to them. Similarly, those concerns have provoked increased public demonstration against the government's approach towards the country's development agenda, sometimes giving rise to lawsuits against proposed or ongoing development projects, challenging them as violation of fundamental rights guaranteed by the Constitution of Sri Lanka. So against this backdrop, let me draw your attention to some of the disputed development projects that illustrate what I just explained. Unfortunately, I don't have time to discuss all these events, but I would like to briefly explain controversy over the proposal to develop the East Container Terminal of the East or the ECT at the Colombo Port as a joint venture with the Adani Ports and Special Economic Zone Limited, the Indian government nominated investor, as media reported. This arrangement was based on the agreement that Sri Lanka entered into with India and Japan in 2019 to develop the strategic ECT at the Colombo port. However, the proposed joint venture with the Indian investor attracted significant public attention over its geopolitical concerns. It was strongly opposed by the country's trade unions, alleging that the Indian government's motivation for this investment project was its need to counterbalance the increased Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean, particularly China's presence in the Colombo port through its investment in the South Container Terminal. Opponents further alleged that the India sought to achieve this objective through the infrastructure development project in Sri Lanka by forcing Sri Lanka to hand over the development and the operation of a significant Colombo port terminal to the Indian-nominated Adani Group. Although the government wanted to justify this project, saying that the Sri Lanka must consider many types of companies when it comes to foreign investment, the ultimately government had to unilaterally cancel the agreement, prompting India to demand Sri Lanka abide by its commitments with India and Japan. Considering these diplomatic concerns, Sri Lanka subsequently entered into an agreement with the originally nominated Indian investor to develop the west container terminal of the Colombo port instead of the east to sustain its relationship with these two nations amidst the increased geopolitical rivalry. So, in my opinion, the saga of ECT demonstrates how Sri Lanka has been trapped in this geopolitical competition, which cannot be managed without a clear plan to exploit the opportunities. As Matthew said, the opportunities offered by these projects and trade development programs while minimizing risk associated with them. So, as rightly pointed out in the literature, Asia has become a region where development programs are taking on greater geopolitical weight. At the same time, indicating the gravity of this increased geopolitical competition in the region, Sri Lanka was once asked by the former US Secretary of the State, Mike Pompeo, during his visit to Sri Lanka to choose between the Chinese Communist Party, which he terms as the predator, and the USA as a friend and partner, even though Sri Lanka wanted to be neutral in the increased race for the influence in Asia. So finally, Sri Lanka's perspective on rivalry and development has given rise to a set of questions that requires more profound policy and legal analysis about the implication of this new great game on the discourses on development. To mention a few, how does it impact the country's existing model of development and policy space in decision making? How it shapes the national development agendas of a given country or its development priorities, how it shapes the national, how it impacts the state control over the entry of foreign investment and its control over the operation of the establishment of foreign investment. So does it impact the people's full sovereignty over their natural resources and wealth? So does it impact the right of people to self-determination? And lastly, but not the least, does it foster the supports the friendly relations between a state in crucial areas such as net sustainability, development aid, international, and trade? So with these thoughts, I conclude my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Dilini. And if we can return to the panel. Again, thanks so much for a wonderful presentation. And given all the challenges that Sri Lanka faces, it's clear that what it needs is a government of expert, principled people who will govern and guide the country through all these difficulties with integrity and purpose. And I'm not quite sure whether the current government meets those criteria. So thanks so much. Again, a lot to talk about. And now let's move to Emi's presentation, because Japan has had a very influential role in so many different aspects of development. Japan, even in the early 1990s, had a different model of development, which it was trying to promote through the World Bank. But the World Bank wasn't particularly receptive to that. And Japan, of course, has supported the Asian Development Bank and so forth. So it's very important to hear about a Japanese perspective. So let me thank Emi. And please, Emi, we'd like to hear from you.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you for inviting me as the speaker today. And I'm honored to be here. let me share the screen. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so I'm Amy. I'm working at the Center for Asian Legal Exchange called KALE, Nagoya University, Japan. And then I'd like to talk about the Japanese government approach of international cooperation, especially in the legal area. So in 1992, Japan adopted the ODA Charter, which became a primary roadmap for foreign aid. And before that, Japan will criticize that the Japanese aid are narrow in terms of national economic interest, as it only focused on the hard infrastructure development of project. So then after the adoption of the 1992 ODA Charter, it's established a new philosophy in which it's a foreign aid, apart from hard infrastructure, also about a knowledge-based support of soft infrastructure of the self-help efforts and a fair distribution of resources, good governance, and developing human resources. And at that time, in 1990s, many socialist countries have made a transition into market economy. So in the context of the post-socialist transition in Asia, Japan's advisory knowledge sharing service laid the foundation for the promotion of Japanese legal technical assistance in Southeast Asia. And later, so we expanded the project in Eastern and Central Asia. So you can see this map where Japanese government worked on the cooperation for legal and judicial development. So the first country we worked on, it was Vietnam in 1996. So it was maybe compared to other Western countries or financial institutions, we are the new donors among the legal assistance area. And we expanded to the cooperation in Cambodia, Laos, or other parts of Asia. So I don't talk in detail about this. So next, I'd like to talk about the characteristics of Japanese legal assistance philosophy. So first one is a request-based principle. So Japanese ODA introduced a request-based principle. So that means a recipient needs to ask Japan donor for help. If we don't receive any request from them, we don't offer anything. The first project in Vietnam I introduced in 1996, it was also the request from Ministry of Justice to Japanese government. And the second one is respecting recipients' ownership and supporting self-help efforts. So Japan tried to non-interference to the domestic matters in Asian states. So if there is a problem in their countries, we don't offer, Japanese government doesn't offer donor-backed solutions, but respect the dialogue-based assistance. And third one is emphasizing the long-term development. That means the human resource development, mainly legal education. And the fourth one is emphasizing the local context. That is influence from our modernization legal development. Like more than 100 years ago, Japan referred to Western legal concept from Germany, from French, and after World War II, we borrowed the concept from US. However, we customize these concepts as to address our local culture and society. So we have this kind of experience, and the philosophy is influenced by this experience. And the last one is a focus in the private law area. And the Japanese legal assistance has been directed toward the promoting a market economy in the former or current social countries. And they need to introduce the private law concept like private property. And Japan received many requests from those countries to work on this area. So we work on civil law, civil procedure law, bankruptcy, company law, like that. We recently expanded the area to administrative law area as well. But the Japanese government doesn't touch human rights issue with that area. And who are the major actors in Japan? So mainly the two key actors, they are JICA, Japanese International Cooperation Agency, that is a development agency in Japan under the Japanese Foreign Ministry, and also Ministry of Justice is the key actors, and they have International Cooperation Department, and also Japanese Bar Association and Japanese university like us involved in the legal technical assistance project in Asia. I just would like to introduce some activities done by our university. So our Center for Asian Legal Exchange, established in 2002, so it was 20 years ago. And CAIL is the only specialized institution among Japanese university that's focusing on promoting international cooperation in law and political science. And our mission is mainly producing human resources in Asia, and that is in line with the Japanese government policy. So we launched the English-based course in 1999, and we accepted so many students, many government officials and university teaching staff to university. And every year we have about 100 students from those countries. And so now our graduates play a very key role in their governments, like Minister of Justice of Vietnam, Deputy Minister, something like that. And our unique program started in 2005, launched Japanese law centers in Asian countries like in Uzbekistan, Mongolia, Vietnam, and Cambodia. And so I'd like to talk about the case of Myanmar to provide you a better understanding of the specific of Japanese legal assistance philosophy. I think many of you know that Myanmar has a problem with the democracy and human rights. And yeah, so there was a military coup in 2021, and so the full scale of cooperation initiated in 2013. So after the shift to civilian rule, that the Japanese government-based scholarship for Myanmar officials, it was started since 2006. So it was under the military rule. And so the Japanese government was criticized by many countries. Why Japan support the military government? And it has some mixed explanation that. So after the shift to the civilian rule in 2011, so those people who studied in Japan played important roles in the democratization process. And so after the coup in February 21, even after that, Japan didn't formally suspend its assistance project in Myanmar. So in fact, the Japanese government doesn't dispatch any expert right now. So Japanese government uses the COVID-19 as an excuse, but never express its position about the coup. And you may also surprise that even after the coup, Japanese government received continued to accept the Myanmar officials in Japan. And Nagoya University has received Myanmar officials at the university. But recently, Ministry of Foreign Affairs recently suspended accepting students. So this is my last slide. So equally with the rule of law, Japan pays specific attention to the mutual understanding. And yeah, there's a problem with the human rights and democracy field. So simply speaking, human rights and democracy are not a priority under the Japanese philosophy. And scholars say that Japanese legal technical systems might be convenient to engage with legal reforms in authoritarian states, such as, for example, Myanmar, as I explained, as the donor state not have a genuine overarching concerns with the human rights norms. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Amy. I wonder whether you can stop share so that we can return to the panel. And again, thank you for a fascinating presentation dealing with the, Japan's soft power. And again, this interesting question of, is there a distinctive Japanese approach? And I think there's a question here that affects so many development programs about how to view the local political conditions. And it seems that there's an emerging theme that the Asian approach basically seems to hold, that we don't explicitly care about democracy and human rights, that we deal with whoever is there in power and take it from there, which is rather convenient. But thanks for these very rich presentations. Let's go to questions because we don't have much time. And Alan Franklin has asked you a very interesting question, Aparna, about whether the court looks into the actualities of these development programs or actually considers the corruption which often drives these development programs. And I think, Delaney, you would have a lot to say about corruption and development programs as well. And it raises a larger issue, perhaps, of how Japan and China might deal with issues of corruption and whether it's something that is taken into account. Of course, there's an interesting question about whether Western development actually took into account corruption either, because we can think of so many cases in which, on one hand, there were proclamations about rule of law and everything else, but on the other, various regimes that were not particularly democratic were being supported by, Western countries in various ways. So, a range of issues, but we'll start with you, Aparna. But I think the rest of you would also have something interesting to say.
So one thing to say about the Indian Supreme Court's approach is that formally, at least when it's engaged with the question, it has always said that it is because of separation of power concerns, it will not look at the validity of the development goals of the state. But it actually doesn't adopt that kind of a neutral attitude, right? Because it's using the language of right to development to actually legitimate the development goals of the state and to delegitimate resistance to those development goals. So it's very actively, working hand in hand with the government. And that's, I think, largely because judges are the beneficiaries of these development programs. They don't bear the burden of, face the burden of these development programs. So we're seeing a replication of, the global patterns of the center and the periphery very much within the nation state as well, where the extractive conditions of development are benefiting a particular group and the burden is being borne by others. Within that paradigm and without questioning that paradigm, the court is happy to engage with improving the efficiency of the development program. So including if there are leakages through corruptions to the public exchequer, the court will step right in and look at those questions. And there have been cases where the court has, for example, struck down the allocation of natural resources because of allegations of corruption, so on and so forth. So but without questioning the overall paradigm. And I just want to make a point, since I have the floor, because this came up in Delaney's presentation, and I thought we were all talking about nation states, but we weren't talking about private parties within these nation states, multinational corporations operating out of the global south now, that are playing a role that many of these multinational corporations from the West used to play in development projects. And the Adani sort of example that you gave was very instructive, because of course Adani is a big player in India and is really engaged in a lot of these development projects that are facing this kind of popular resistance and backlash in India, in Sri Lanka, in Australia. And there's also, of course, then the whole question going back to corruption is the question of crony capitalism and the links between these private players and the government of the day, which then allows the government to push their sort of favored capitalists into these development regimes across the region.
Thanks so much, Aparna. If I may give each of you, Delaney, Matthew, and Emmy, just a minute. We don't have much time. We've got 4 minutes to respond to that range of issues about corruption and development in the particular context of your presentation. Delaney?
Thank you for
1 minute.
I think, one of the biggest allegations against the Chinese investment in Sri Lanka and rest of the, especially when it comes to other global south, southern countries like African countries, one of the main allegation is corruption. So I always thinking about to what extent we can think about in the context of these development projects, to how these problems should be addressed at the national level. So that is one of the questions, because if you really wanted to get this, because in Sri Lanka, most of these like very recent projects, also the biggest problem against some of the development project is the public procurement process has not been followed clearly. Not it's with come to the Chinese investment. Another project is related to this, especially the Yugadanavi or the power plant project, which the American investors included involved in this project. Again, the procurement process has not been clearly followed. But I think in terms of that, the hosting countries, like the countries that receiving these development projects, has to do a lot to ensure the transparency of the project, to ensure the development.
Thanks so much, Delaney. I think there's an interesting situation in Sri Lanka where I think that a Chinese corporation alleged that a Sri Lankan consortium had received, had been successful at a bid and basically the Chinese accused the Sri Lankans of corruption because of the way in which the Sri Lankan consortium succeeded, even though their bid was so much more. So we've got that other dimension as well.
Thank you, Professor.
So Matthew.
Sure. Thank you, Tony. Thanks. Also following after Delaney, whose comments I echo. I mean, I think certainly there is a corruption problem in the Chinese outbound investment projects and their development projects overseas. How serious is it? It's very hard to say because of the nature of the kind of opacity that's involved in these projects, very little oversight, very little public accountability. It's not a problem that's unique to China, as Tony mentioned. If people are interested in this question, I suggest John Perkins' book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. I joke within my research group that I'd like to write the book Confessions of a Chinese Economic Hitman, because these problems do occur. I think the question is China incentivized to govern corruption overseas? And I think mostly what we see is no, not really, because the SOEs, state-owned enterprises, their interests are very much aligned with those of the state. China does have its own version of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in Article 164 of the criminal law, but it has not yet, interestingly, pushed by the US government in 2011 as an example of the US transplantation of its own normative approach overseas. However, it's not been litigated. It has not been used, to my knowledge. There's no court decision that cites this particular provision. So you can see it's an unused source of norms. So we'll see what happens in the future. I would agree with Delaney that really comes down to the host state and their capacity to govern these issues. However, the problem again is that when the political elites are essentially in bed with the Chinese partners, then it's very hard to get any sort of oversight over these projects. And oftentimes courts are excluded altogether in what happens. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Sure. I mean, in Sri Lanka, one almost gets the impression that different political actors are closely connected with different great powers, and they use their particular authority in parliament or whatever else to block their rivals as part of this process. So they've got proxies, as it were, integrated into the local systems, which makes it really complicated. Emmy, we'd like to think that Japan takes a different approach. Okay, authoritarianism is one thing, but what about corruption?
So as I took during my presentation, Japan usually have the approach of the request-based, and also our focus is on the private law area. We don't have a much project related to the corruption, but we have a united we call UNIFAI, United Nations Asian and Far East Institute, under the Ministry of Justice, and they work on the corruption issue. For example, having a seminar to the government officials like that. Yeah, that's all.
Yeah. So thanks, Emmy. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time now. But I just like to thank our panelists because I've learned so much. I think it's fascinating to see the different dimensions of development that have been discussed here and to see the contrasts and connections. And I hope this will be the beginning of perhaps a broader discussion in so many respects. And let me also thank all the participants for joining us at this point of time. I'm sorry we couldn't have a further discussion, but it's been a very rich event. And let me thank everybody and wish everyone a good morning, evening, afternoon, as the case may be. All the best.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you.
Bye.